a lone rider collapsed at the gates of Edinburgh, his message confirming the pact that ignited the Second Civil War. 24,000 Scottish men marched south under the Duke of Hamilton, utterly blind to Oliver Cromwell, who was riding with the speed of vengeance. This is the story of how an army twice the size of its enemy was obliterated in a 3-day, non-stop chase. The year was 1648. A fragile peace had collapsed after the captured King Charles I struck a desperate, secret bargain with Scottish leaders. The king, held by Parliament, was desperate for restoration, and the Scottish nobles, primarily motivated by their own political and religious ambitions, saw a chance for power. In exchange for the Scots invading England, the king made promises that satisfied the nobles' terms. This agreement gave rise to the massive, sprawling army of the Engagers. The man in command, James Hamilton, the first Duke of Hamilton, was a grandee of the Scottish court, focused on political prestige rather than military genius. He was a commander burdened by obligation and ambition, but lacking in crucial military instinct. His force reflected this debilitating lack of unified purpose. It was enormous in size, perhaps 24,000 men, but crippled by its own composition. It was composed of raw, poorly equipped Scottish levies, often conscripted and lacking discipline, and supported by a haphazard baggage train that constantly struggled to keep up with the column. Hamilton himself possessed little of the martial fire that defined the great commanders of the age. He was cautious where he needed to, be daring, and agonizingly indecisive when speed was everything. The Engager army was a massive, lumbering giant, its sheer physical size making it feel invincible, but its internal disarray and lack of coherence made it fatally fragile. As Hamilton's vast force crossed the border into England in July, it entered the counties of Lancashire and Cheshire, a region famous for its narrow, deeply rutted country roads, steep hills, and dense woodland. This was unforgiving terrain, the very opposite of the wide-open plains ideal for marching and maneuvering a grand army of such size. Yet Hamilton made his first fatal error, a decision rooted in overconfidence and poor supply management. He strung his army out. Instead of keeping his force consolidated and within immediate supporting distance, he allowed the army to become a serpentine column, stretching for over 45 miles along the muddy lanes. The infantry marched ahead, while the valuable cavalry force, led by the experienced but politically unreliable English royalist Sir Marmaduke Langdale, was positioned far away to the east. This distribution made the army an impossible target to mass for defense, and a guaranteed target to break for any agile enemy. Crucially, Hamilton failed to deploy a proper cavalry screen or conduct effective reconnaissance. He marched in confidence, utterly convinced that his bulk alone was a sufficient deterrent. Hamilton's scouts were looking south. Cromwell was coming from the side. The reason for his confidence was simple. He believed the most dangerous man in England was hundreds of miles away, besieged in Pembroke, Wales, dealing with royalist uprisings. In truth, Oliver Cromwell had crushed the Welsh resistance with characteristic speed. The moment Pembroke fell, Cromwell turned his gaze north. His famous, unyielding religious conviction transformed his military command into a destiny. His army was not just a professional force. It was a Puritan instrument of divine will, fueled by the fierce belief that their cause was righteous. To Cromwell, the Scots were hypocrites, having struck a deal with the man of blood, King Charles, and the coming confrontation at Preston was now not just a battle, but a holy reckoning. With an urgency that defied the logistics of the 17th century, Cromwell began his punishing march north. Covering over 200 miles in less than a month, he pushed his veteran troops and their famous new model discipline to the absolute limit. This army was the precise antithesis of Hamilton's engagers, smaller, perhaps 9,000 men in total, but composed of highly paid, religiously zealous, and perfectly drilled soldiers. Cromwell's cavalry, the legendary Ironsides, was especially feared, trained to charge in a tight knee-to-knee formation, hitting with the concentrated force of a battering ram. He joined up with the smaller northern parliamentarian forces under Major General John Lambert, bringing his total strength to roughly 10,000 men. He bypassed traditional routes, instead cutting across the difficult Pennine Hills, a strategic masterstroke, placing Cromwell's army not in front of the massive Scottish host, but on their vulnerable left flank. 50 miles to the southeast, a religious cavalryman who never stopped fighting was already cutting a direct secret line through the mountains. Hamilton's scouts were looking south. Cromwell was coming from the side. As Cromwell's scouts began reporting the catastrophic distribution of the Scottish army, a ribbon of soldiers strung along the marching route, Cromwell's convictions solidified. God, he believed, had delivered the enemy into his hands. His forces pressed their advance, marching through driving rain that turned the roads into rivers of mud. Cromwell's men endured the exhaustion, sustained by their fierce belief and the knowledge that they were marching to crush the final vestiges of the king's resistance. The first day of the battle was only hours away, and the vast army of the engagers, stretched thin and exhausted, was about to be struck by thunder they never heard approaching. The dense, cold morning mist of August 17th, 1648, hung heavy over the rolling hills of Lancashire. General John Lambert, a parliamentarian scout, straining his ears, heard the muffled tramp of an immense marching column, Cromwell's army, arriving from the east, appearing at a speed that defied age. They had caught the enemy completely flat-footed. Cromwell gazed out over the terrain and saw no grand marshaled army prepared for battle. He saw only the endless, vulnerable flank of the enemy, strung out along the roads leading from Preston, moving slowly south. He made a decision that ignored all military convention. He would not wait for the enemy to consolidate. He would attack the column while it was in motion, striking not at a traditional defensive line, but at a serpent's body. The initial engagement took place on the eastern edges of Preston, near the town of Warrington. The first to bear the brunt of Cromwell's assault were the English royalists under Sir Marmaduke Langdale, positioned as the northernmost flank guard. Langdale's men were veteran cavaliers, fighting for their traditional king, but they were tragically isolated and heavily outnumbered. They had expected skirmishes. They received the full, terrifying shock of Cromwell's well-rested main force. Cromwell's troops advanced with ruthless efficiency. His musketeers delivered controlled, disciplined volleys, their fire steady despite the wet powder and the driving rain. Following them, the pikemen advanced in tight, disciplined blocks, ready to repel any countercharge. This relentless, grinding advance was everything the new model army stood for. Relentless precision against the disorganized, desperate defense mounted by Langdale's outnumbered cavaliers. For 4 exhausting hours, Langdale and his men fought with incredible ferocity, giving ground slowly, buying precious time for the main Scottish infantry body to react to the surprise. The core of the fighting quickly centered on the Ribble Bridge, a critical crossing point that controlled the road into Preston and access to the south. The loss of the bridge would mean the complete severing of the Scottish army. Cromwell personally directed his troops to press the attack. Langdale fought for 4 exhausting hours, giving everything to buy time. But where was Hamilton? The Duke was miles away, receiving only panicked, contradictory reports, and by the time he grasped the scale of the attack, the most important piece of ground on the entire battlefield, was already lost. Miles away, the Duke of Hamilton received only a trickle of panicked, contradictory reports. His first reaction was denial, assuming the fighting was just a minor skirmish with local militia. By the time the news confirmed the presence of Cromwell himself, Hamilton was paralyzed by indecision. His main infantry force was already several hours south of Preston. He could not turn them around quickly without creating a total administrative disaster. Nor could he commit his main reserve force, fearing a phantom attack from another direction. His failure to consolidate his scattered units or grasp the speed of Cromwell's approach was an act of command suicide. The legendary Ironsides cavalry broke through the royalist flanks, forcing Langdale's men to retreat desperately through the cobbled streets of Preston toward the bridge. It was a desperate race against the clock. By nightfall, the Ribble Bridge was lost, and Preston town was in parliamentarian hands. The remnant of Langdale's force, utterly spent, had been swallowed by the main body of the Scottish column that was now forced into a desperate retreat. The new model army had decisively won the first day of fighting, but the battle was not over. It had merely begun. Cromwell had smashed the front of the Serpent, but the body was now writhing away, trying to escape the trap. Cromwell's men, despite their exhaustion, rested on the ground they had won, knowing they had inflicted a crippling blow. The main Scottish army, defeated but not destroyed, was now fleeing south towards Wigan. The first day was over, and the chase, the most devastating aspect of the campaign, had commenced. The pursuit began at dawn on August 18th. It was no longer a structured battle. The retreat of the engagers had immediately devolved into a rout, and Cromwell was there to ensure it stayed that way. The long, narrow country lanes of Lancashire, choked with mud and lined with dense hedgerows, became the bloody road south. This difficult terrain, which had initially hindered Hamilton's organized march, now made his panicked retreat catastrophic. The roads were an absolute nightmare. They were clogged not just with Scottish musketeers and pikemen, but with the vast, sprawling baggage trains, the sick, and the thousands of wounded men. The heavy, relentless summer rain continued to fall, turning the pathways into deep quagmires, swallowing up boots, wheels, and any sense of military cohesion. The sky was dark and heavy, a perfect mirror of the dark mood that had settled upon the retreating army. All they could hear, a relentless, rhythmic sound through the mist, were the hoofbeats of Cromwell's pursuing cavalry. This day embodied the essence of the running battle. The new model army was now in its element, highly motivated, religiously zealous, and faster than any other force on the continent. The Scottish army was disorganized, demoralized, and plagued by hunger and the collapse of its supply lines. They were no longer an army. They were a massive, panicked crowd, and Cromwell was operating on a principle of systematic destruction. All along the road, small-scale, vicious skirmishing erupted. The parliamentarian cavalry would charge into the retreating column, slice through the rearguard, destroy the baggage wagons, and take hundreds of prisoners before retreating back to the main pursuit force. This wasn't about capturing territory. It was about dismantling the enemy's will to fight. It was psychological warfare, executed at a brutal speed. Every mile covered meant more abandonments, more men falling out due to exhaustion, and more equipment left for the pursuing parliamentarians. The chain of command among the engagers collapsed entirely. Hamilton, the Duke, was no longer thinking of winning the war. He was concerned only with saving himself and his core troops. He gave orders to abandon stragglers and even large parts of the baggage train, including the army's dwindling food stores. The already fragile alliance between the Royalist veterans under Langdale and the Scottish infantry fractured completely, as each general focused on saving his own men. They had no idea where the Parliamentarian army ended and where safety began. The pressure reached its peak in the afternoon at Wigan Lane. Here, a Scottish rearguard, commanded by the experienced Lieutenant General William Bailey, attempted a desperate stand. They barricaded the narrow, sunken lane, creating a defensive trap to buy time for the main body to escape. It was a brutal, close-quarters engagement. The fighting devolved into a chaotic, hand-to-hand struggle in the mud, where pikes and sword blades were the only weapons that mattered. The Parliamentarian forces, though suffering heavy casualties, eventually overwhelmed the weary, demoralized Scots, completely depleting the last of the Engager veterans. If this dramatic journey into history and military strategy has captured your attention, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future explorations of the battles that shaped our world. Your engagement is our highest priority. Hamilton, with the pathetic remnant of his forces, finally staggered into Wigan. His army was now a shadow of the great host that had marched across the border. He stopped, exhausted, believing that the darkness and the sheer physical toll would force Cromwell to pause his pursuit. The rearguard was broken, and the bloody road south was won. Hamilton was now a fugitive, but he thought the dark would save him. He didn't understand the relentless, almost spiritual fury of his opponent. Cromwell had ordered his men to ride through the night. The chase would not pause. August 19th. Exhausted and desperate, the remnants of the Scottish army staggered toward the town of Warrington. The River Mersey lay before them, and the Duke of Hamilton intended to cross it, believing the river would offer a natural barrier and salvation. But there was only one bridge, and as the thousands of broken men converged on it, panic set in. This was the moment of ultimate catastrophe. Hamilton had spent 3 days retreating, and now he found his army surrounded on 3 sides. Cromwell's relentless cavalry was pressing from the north, snapping at his heels. But the final crushing force was the arrival of Colonel Robert Lilburn and his small Parliamentarian force from the west, which had crossed the river and positioned itself to close the escape route. The Engager army had stumbled directly into the final, inescapable trap. The scene at Warrington Bridge was utter chaos. The single crossing point was a deadly bottleneck. Men fought each other simply to reach the bridge, while Cromwell's vanguard cavalry began charging the rear ranks. Hamilton, the Duke, made a final, shameful decision. To save himself and his remaining corps of cavalry, he ordered the abandonment of a huge portion of his foot soldiers. He gave command of the infantry, some 4,000 disheartened Scots, to Lieutenant General Bailey, and rode off with his cavalry, escaping south toward Nantwich. This act of self-preservation sealed the fate of the Scottish foot soldiers, sacrificing them to buy his own freedom. The result was the immediate surrender of Warrington. Trapped and surrounded, with no hope of supplies or reinforcement, General Bailey, knowing he had been deliberately sacrificed, had no option but to raise the white flag. The sheer scale of the surrender was astonishing. Over 3,000 men, the best of the remaining Scottish infantry, laid down their arms to Colonel Lilburn, who, only days before, had been considered a minor supporting commander. The victory was total. Cromwell, having led the furious pursuit, rode up to witness the surrender. The sight of thousands of captured men, their resistance broken, served only to solidify his spiritual resolve. He did not boast of his generalship, but of divine favor. He framed the victory not as a military conquest, but as an act of God, stating that the enemy's hypocrisy and wicked design had led the Lord to deliver them into the hands of the faithful. But the finality of the victory required the capture of Hamilton himself. The Duke's escape was a futile, exhausted dash. He and his remaining cavalry raced south, only to find the country already alerted and hostile. Within days, he was tracked down near Atoxeter by a smaller parliamentarian mop-up force. The once proud commander of the 24,000-man Engager army surrendered not to Cromwell, but to a force that barely numbered 1,000. The great Engager army was gone, scattered, captured or dead. The 3-day running battle was over. The blood-soaked battlefields of Lancashire, Preston, Wigan, Warrington fell silent. The sheer scale of the victory was an upset of enormous military proportions. Cromwell had defeated a force more than twice his size while on the march, effectively destroying it as a fighting unit over a running battle of 3 continuous days. The parliamentarian casualties were astonishingly light, numbering only a few hundred men, while the Scottish and Royalist losses amounted to over 2,000 dead and at least 10,000 captured soldiers. The battle secured the strategic outcome. It was the end of all organised Royalist resistance in the Second Civil War. The immediate aftermath, however, was grim. The fate of the 10,000 captured Scots was brutal. They were marched south in ragged, starving columns, forced into labour, transported to the West, Indies, or put into forced labour in Ireland. This cold, efficient disposal of a broken enemy underscored the absolute nature of the Puritan victory. This military triumph was a political earthquake. Preston gave Cromwell the mandate to purge Parliament of moderates, dismantle the last obstacle, and march the king himself to trial. The victory led directly to the brutal act known as Pride's Purge, where parliamentarian soldiers removed every member of Parliament not aligned with the army's radical position. The destruction of the Engager army paved the way for the most dramatic and unthinkable event in British history, the trial of King Charles I. The Battle of Preston elevated Oliver Cromwell to the undeniable, dominant, political and military figure in the 3 kingdoms. His strategic genius, his relentless speed, and his utter conviction proved that he was the only man capable of commanding such a force. The victory gave him the moral and military authority to demand the ultimate act of regicide. If you found the details of this historic 3-day chase compelling, please share this video with other history enthusiasts you know. Every share helps us bring these incredible, often overlooked stories to a wider audience. The running battle in the mud of Lancashire didn't just break an army, it broke the monarchy and ushered in a brutal, unprecedented republic. The silence that fell over those fields was the silence before the final, historic blow. Its only echo would be the sound of the executioner's axe falling on a cold January morning, a blow made inevitable by one man's relentless speed. The Siege of Preston is a powerful story of how discipline and speed can utterly obliterate an enemy, and it proves that history isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the most relentless. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.